Okay, welcome everyone to the Blavatnik School of Government here at the University of Oxford and the event on the future of social policy, social assistance in Africa and beyond. We're delighted tonight to have with us Jim Ferguson from Stanford University and Paul Niehaus from University of California in San Diego. I'll introduce them more in just a minute. I'm Chris Woodruff, a professor of development economics here at the University of Oxford, and I want to begin by recognizing the Center for the Study of African Economies, which is my hat up here, and the Blavatnik School of Government for their support for this event. So we're joined by Jim Ferguson, who's a professor of anthropology at Stanford University. Jim has a long and distinguished career doing research in Southern Africa, including two very notable books. One, The Anti-Politics Machine, which was his dissertation that any of us would have died to write in terms of quality and effectiveness and impact. And the other more recent book, Give a Man a Fish, which is much more on topic of the discussion tonight. So I won't say much more about the book because Jim will bring up, I'm sure, a lot of the ideas in it as we go through. Paul Niehaus is an associate professor of economics at UC San Diego and co-founder of Give Directly and Segovia. He'll explain Give Directly in just a minute. Segovia is an electronic payments platform. Paul's also a leading 100 global thinker named by Foreign Policy. And I think what I find impressive about Paul, and we overlapped for some very short time at San Diego, is that most of most researchers would be very happy with his research output. And he does that while he's also out creating these big organizations and doing all this work in the field. So I think that's really what's impressive with him. So let me start, Paul, by asking you to just tell us something about Give Directly and how it got started and where you work and what the model is.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Chris. Chris, when you say we overlapped, actually, I think we had coffee.
Yeah, that's right. That's
at my job talk, and Chris convinced me to come and then left. So that's being a bit generous, but no, it's great to be here. Thank you all for coming. I know it's exam week for some of you. I hope not too stressful. I know there's a vote tomorrow. Again, uncertainty, maybe some anxiety. Wanted to say, no matter how things go tomorrow, you can't possibly end up in a worse spot than we are. So, yeah, hopefully we can relax and take our minds off of all that and think a bit big picture and long term today. So I'm really excited. I got to read Jim's book in getting ready for this, and I'm excited to learn from him and discuss with all of you guys. In terms of Give Directly is the only, the first NGO, I think the only one right now that's kind of exclusively devoted to giving money to poor people in developing countries. And that is sort of surprising when you think about it, because it is such a simple and obvious way to help people who don't have a lot of money. We started Give Directly when my co-founders, Michael, Jeremy, and Rohit, and I were grad students. We were doing our graduate degrees in development economics at Harvard and MIT, and reflected two observations we had about the way the world was changing. The first was that we were in the midst of this impact evaluation boom, I guess, which is still going on, but it was really the first time in the early 2000s, I think, that in a big way we started to experimentally test different ideas for helping to alleviate poverty. And that's kind of crazy, but for the first 50 years or so of anti-poverty work, there was very, very little of that. And one of the, long story short, there were kind of things coming out of this that did not work as well as we'd all hoped or thought, some things that worked better. But one of the clear lessons from dozens and dozens of high-quality impact evaluations being done was that cash transfers seem to be quite effective at improving people's lives. And in particular, some of the negative stereotypes, you give people money, they're just going to get drunk or they're going to waste it, didn't seem to be bearing out in the data. So that was observation number one. And then observation number two, Chris mentioned some work I do in fintech. I think we were becoming aware of some of the exciting things happening in last mile payments infrastructure. And so the short story there is whether it's mobile money in East Africa or business correspondent banking in India using biometric ID, we are moving fairly rapidly, not as fast as I would like, but fairly rapidly, towards a world in which we can pay anyone, anywhere, anytime, quite cheaply and quite securely. And so when we looked at those two things together, we said we think this has potentially pretty profound potential to reshape the way we fight poverty, both as individual donors. Americans give around $20 billion a year to international development, and also potentially as official donors, as aid-sending governments. And we were excited to do something about that. We felt like at a minimum, individual people like you and I ought to be able to give money to poor people, given everything that we knew. And we thought it was crazy that did not exist. And so, Narrowly Give Directly's plan and vision is to build that platform and to break into the big leagues of international charitable giving. The big players in our space are the billion-dollar organizations, and that's where we want to get. Give Directly right now is moving about $50 million a year to East Africa and growing quickly. But I think that at almost a moral level, like at a broader level, we also think that there is a need to pretty profoundly and deeply rethink the way we think about and stereotype and talk about poor people, and that they should probably have a much larger role in making decisions about how aid money gets spent. One way I like to think about that is that you can think about that as the default. Sort of ask, if this money were in the hands of a poor person, is there a strong case that I, as an aid worker or an NGO worker, have a better idea about what to do with it than they do? And we do think there may be cases where that's true, but we think that just doing that, right, asking that question would be a really healthy check on a lot of the, frankly, quite absurd things that aid money sometimes gets spent on. So that's the short story on Give Directly, and we can get deeper on any of that as you guys wish.
Great. And Jim, how did you get interested in cash transfers, and in particular in the Southern African region?
Yeah, well, I really come at it from the other end from Paul, because I'm not a policy person, and I'm not coming at this saying what would be the most effective kind of anti-poverty program here. I'm thinking of it as an anthropologist who's interested in processes of, interested in processes of social change in the Southern African region, first of all. And there I have an experience of having done research in mining communities, of places where people supported themselves by selling their labor to this huge labor-sucking mining industry that has been such a dominant part of the political economy of Southern Africa for a long time. And so the question of, well, where does your livelihood come from is largely a question of who do you work for, right? What's your job? And this is taken for granted in most of the world, that people either obtain their livelihoods or ought to obtain their livelihoods by working for it. And so we say, what do you do? And you say, oh, I'm an engineer, or I'm a teacher. I'm dealing with the ethnographic consequences of people who used to make their living that way no longer being able to do so. And huge numbers of people who used to have wage laboring jobs have lost them in recent decades. In Southern Africa, but not only in Southern Africa, right? It's an extreme case, but it's also a case that is comparable to some things that go on in the rest of the world. And so I became interested in the question, well, so what if not wage labor is supporting people's livelihoods? And it becomes possible to see that there's actually a lot of different ways people have of making livelihoods that are not about selling their labor, that have become more visible lately, right? They may have been there before, but they're suddenly more prominent. People rely on them more heavily, and some of them are new. So among the many different kinds of what I call distributive livelihoods that I'm interested in, I took a special interest in the cash transfers. In South Africa, they're called social grants. And they have become extremely important. More than 30% of the entire population gets a social grant of some kind every month. It's close to half of all households rely on those social grants in one way or another to get by. And so it's, in some ways, the most straightforward and pure case of a distributive livelihood is where the state just gives you cash and you use it to do things like buy groceries. What strikes me, though, is that the programs that I've studied in Southern Africa are still based on the idea that we live in a world where able-bodied men all have jobs, and where social assistance is for people who, for one reason or another, are not able-bodied men. So you have, well, people get old, so there's going to be pensions. And, well, children can't work yet, so there's going to be some special provision for children. So maybe you have a child care grant, as they do in South Africa. And, well, people sometimes get injured or disabled, so you have a special program. There are ways of dealing with, through social assistance, a whole range of cases that are in one way or another deemed to be an exception to the normal rule. The normal rule being people should work for their distributive claim, right? If you're going to get a check every month, it should be because you work for it. And that assumption is held with particular virulence with respect to this category called able-bodied men. In spite of the fact that huge numbers of able-bodied men, much as they would like it, are not able to access wage labor, right? They would love to work, but nobody wants to hire them. So the question then is, what comes next? Where does this go next? And I don't think we know. It's by asking that question that I started to become interested in the idea of basic income and became aware of things like Give Directly. But I think it's not just about basic income. It's about this larger question of how will people secure a distributive share if it's not by selling their labor. And equally interesting, I think, is how can such distributions be justified? How can they be justified politically and ethically and in the experience of the person receiving the transfer? I think the kind of system of allocating social protection based on ability or inability to work has left us with a set of assumptions that social assistance is for the weak or for those who can't make it on their own or for those who are helpless. And in one way or another, it ends up being extremely debilitating and demoralizing for people to be told that you are so unproductive and useless and worthless that we must support you on the public welfare. I don't think distributive transfers have to be understood in that way. In the book, I talk about a range of other ways of understanding what a social payment is or might be. In the US state of Alaska, for instance, people receive payments from the state of Alaska based on the fact that the state of Alaska produces a lot of oil. And the oil revenues are understood to be the property of the people of Alaska. And so they get a check every year, which is their share of the oil revenue. They get the check because it's their oil. They don't understand themselves to be pathetic losers who are receiving welfare. They understand themselves to be getting their rightful share of the oil that rightfully belongs to them. They certainly don't think that they're on welfare. They certainly don't think that they're doing anything wrong or that they should be ashamed of it. They would get quite angry if they didn't get the check because they understand it to be their money, which is coming to them because it's theirs. I think there are some ways in which that case can be generalized to the wealth that is produced by the society in general. This is an old idea. It goes back to Peter Kropotkin, who made an argument that said the reason we're all wealthier than our great-grandparents isn't because we're better than them. It's not because we work harder than them. It's because we are the inheritors of a vast productive apparatus that enables our labor to be fantastically more productive than theirs was. Our wealth, then, is not due to anything we did. It's due to the fact that we have been able to inherit this vastly powerful, collectively produced thing that comes to us from the past. And the argument, then, that Kropotkin makes is, so surely everyone is entitled to share in that collective inheritance, right? Who built the productive apparatus that we all depend on? Well, all of us did, including the ancestors of poor and working people who nowadays have nothing. So there's both a political argument and a kind of moral argument of justification there that's based not on being needy, but on being an owner who's being deprived of something that is properly due to owners. And I saw something a little bit like that in the basic income campaign in Namibia, where I spent some time, where the argument was made, people should get basic income, but the reason they should get basic income is because Namibia is a rich country. And it produces diamonds, and it produces uranium, and it produces valuable stuff that the world needs. And whose wealth is that? And the argument they made is, properly, that wealth belongs to the nation, right? Those are our diamonds. That's our uranium. And if the wealth properly belongs to all of us, then shouldn't all of us receive at least some modest share of it? So it was a way of arguing for a social protection payment, but on very different grounds from the ones we usually see. And I don't suggest that that's a dominant conception in the world, or that it's necessarily going to become the dominant conception in the world. But I find it very interesting, and I find it potentially useful and hopeful indication of the kinds of ways in which we might redefine the meaning of distributive payments of the kind that basic income envisages. I think we've done altogether too little research into this question of what payments mean to people. We've got a lot of studies of how do people spend the money, what do they use it for, does it do them any good, do they drink it away or don't they? We haven't done nearly enough research into the question of what is it in the first place? What does it mean for people to receive this payment? What do they understand it to be? And then there's the question of how might those understandings change over time?
How does the answer to that depend on, so when you think about cash transfer programs, a lot of them are conditional cash transfers, and
Yes.
it depends on certain actions and activities. They're targeted to certain subpopulations, not the population as a whole. I mean, you described the rationale of a share in the productive apparatus of the country, but that sounds like a share to everybody, and what we mostly have. In some senses, I mean, give directly is unconditional, unconditional transfers, but most of the transfers are conditional. So how do we think about?
Yeah, I think it's very important. And as part of the attraction of the basic income campaign is that it is precisely universal, right? I mean, UBI is what they call it, universal basic income. And the people that I talk to in Southern Africa feel very strongly that it must be universal and not conditional, precisely because it's something that is conceived as belonging to everybody. Conditionality has become very popular. It is a way, I think, of responding to the distaste for the idea that people will be getting something for nothing. The idea if you could set it up as an exchange, that no, you get the money, but in exchange you agree to do these things, that this is somehow more politically palatable. I have to say, in South Africa, the argument against that is pretty strong, which is that you don't need conditions to force people to send their kids to school. People want to send their kids to school, and there's really not a major problem of people not doing it. But I think there's also a kind of philosophical opposition, which is rooted in this idea, both a sort of first principles idea that this is something that ought to be due to everyone, and I think also a kind of political calculation that universal programs don't leave people stigmatized. I've heard people refer to the U.S. experience of Social Security versus welfare, right? Everybody pays into the Social Security system. Everybody gets a check when they retire. People feel like it's our system. It belongs to all of us, as opposed to means-targeted programs like welfare, which become very hard to sustain politically because it's figured as they want to take my tax dollars and use it to give to those people, right? So there are political advantages to universality, although it can also be hard to sell.
Yeah.
There's a couple observations. So two observations. So one is two facts, and then sort of some questions or inferences based on those. So one is, as you say, conditionality has been the norm for the most part. All the major Latin American schemes conditional. In India, the largest welfare program in the world is a workfare program, right? Which is you can get money conditional on being willing to show up and do unpleasant work. And, I think that has been a key part of the political sales job, right, in getting these programs enacted, right? So if you talk, for example, to Santiago Levy about Oportunidades in Mexico, which was the seminal conditional cash transfer program, he'd say, we conditioned it on sending your kids to school in part because we wanted kids to go to school, but it was also in part because voters would vote for this, right, and they wouldn't vote for a handout. The interesting thing is part of the art of these things has been in many cases to either not enforce the conditions or to condition on things that most poor people were already doing. So for example, Oportunidades is a very cost-ineffective way at getting kids to go to school because 90% of kids were already going to school before it. And when you're giving free money to that 90%, it's unconditional for the 90% that would have been in school anyway, and it's only conditional for the 10%. So, I think that the idealist in me would love to do what Jim is saying and convince people to change their views. And the pragmatist says, if you want to end poverty or reduce poverty quickly, the right way to do it may often be to condition on something that people are going to do anyway, so that it has the optics of a bargain and the reality of being unconditional. And that's a tough tension. So that was observation number one. Number two is that Africa is an exception to this, right? So almost all of the African countries now have an unconditional cash transfer. And I don't know of a good explanation for why Africa is different, and I'm wondering if either of you do.
I'll tell you, one of the things with respect to conditioning on income, which is one of the big ones, right? Only people below a certain income cutoff are eligible. It's very hard to do that if you don't know what people's incomes are.
Right.
And in most African countries, it would be really almost impossible to come up with a plausible estimate of what someone's income is. You can ask them on a survey and believe what they tell you if you like, but because the relative weakness of formal sector employment and the very weak kind of documentary capacities of African states combine to make it really almost pragmatically impossible. Even in South Africa, I have to say, the people I talked to in social development said, well, yeah, there is an income cutoff. And I said, well, how do you know? And they said, well, we don't. But if they're black and they look poor, they're probably going to get it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How does the Give Directly target? Does it target, and if so, how? And what do you use as
Yeah,
you
so
work
there
in
are,
Africa?
there
You
are,
don't have income
that's
data
right,
you can
that's
trust.
right.
And
There,
so forth.
so there's targeting, and then there are sort of forward-looking conditions, like behaviors that you want to induce. And there's obviously a relationship between the two. Give Directly transfers are targeted but not conditional. And we've used a range of different targeting criteria in different places we've worked. In some cases, they've been poverty scores based on an index of things. I think we've tended to try to err on the side of simplicity. So in some places, it's been as simple as whether your roof is made out of thatch or not. I think one of the mistakes that governments tend to make is they create these very complicated schemes that look great when you run the regression on your computer and seem like very accurate predictors of poverty and are then impossible to implement in the field for kind of some of the reasons that Jim mentioned. So, that's been some of the thinking behind it. But we're actually, I think, internally, I think we're likely to move towards entirely community based, entire villages, right? Choosing villages that are poor, community, but then enrolling everybody in there because, there are a lot of trade-offs, but on net, I think that the value of trying to find the poorer people within these already very poor villages is not that great. And it's been interesting with the first basic income pilot village we've run, which is the first where we've enrolled everybody, that, at least anecdotally, that's something that people really like. Like, they like the fact that everybody's getting it. And there's a sort of a positive vibe around that.
When some people are getting payments and some people aren't, there's often a negative vibe around it, right?
Payments or food or anything.
Of anything, yeah.
That's
I mean,
right. That's right.
In very poor communities, very small things can be sources of really malevolent sorts of envy.
Especially when there's suspicion about how it's been done. Who decided? Was it the village elder? How did I get screwed? Right.
Yeah.
You mentioned, Jim, that maybe people receiving cash transfers would think of themselves as why did I get in this situation? That's stigmatized in a sense. And I guess two questions. One is how important is that as an issue, and then to when you do unconditional transfers, does that seem like an issue in Give Directly's world as well? But
yeah. Well, I think it probably varies from place to place. I mean, there are specificities that make these payments have different meanings in different places. But certainly in Southern Africa, there's a long history of masculinity, in particular, being tied up with waged employment. It was a kind of thing that enabled young men to achieve a certain kind of independence and a certain kind of social power, including the power to marry and found a household and so on. And I think to be told that, no, we can't give you a job, but we can give you this little bit of money, which women and children are already receiving, but maybe you'd like it too, right? It can't help but be seen as a kind of slap in the face. And indeed, if you talk to young men about grants, they'll say, well, grants are fine, but they're for women and children. What a man needs is a job, right? So I think if those are the significations, then it becomes a very hard sell to say, well, no, actually, there aren't going to be any more jobs, but there are other pathways through which you can secure income. But I do think that that's not, doesn't need to be permanent. Significations change over time. And as I said, there's nothing shameful about owning something. And capitalists who receive dividend checks every quarter aren't thrown into paroxysms of shame at the idea that they're receiving something for nothing.
Good. And is it something that you see in the recipients of Give Directly? Is there a stigmatization of receiving the payments, or is it?
Not something we've heard. I think we have a distinct narrative issue, which is, we show up and tell people we're going to give you. So we Give Directly gives people a lot of money. We give people about $1,000 once and then leave. That's about 1 year's income for the average household. And, things like that just don't happen in the world, right? It's like getting a publisher's clearinghouse check. And so, we try to, we tell people this is, donors in America, the UK, wherever have given this money. They want you to do whatever you think is best with it to improve your lives. But like that story just doesn't make sense to a lot of people. And so it creates some narrative vacuum. And there's always risk that gets filled with some story that people come up with, right? So that's so for example, incumbent politicians generally love Give Directly and want to take credit for us being there, and opposition politicians want to spread rumors to try to discourage people from participating, to combat that. So they'll spread the rumor that Give Directly are devil worshippers and that we're going to come back for your kids in a year or something like that. So those are the kinds of narrative issues that we've had to deal with more so than stigma.
So that kind of gets at this issue of politics in a sense, and so I guess a couple questions on that. One, should we worry about leaders using these programs as political vehicles in a sense, and does that skew what we get at? And the other is are these sort of partial solutions? Are they kind of a step along a path, or are they sort of blocking a path in a sense, right? So I could think, if you think that the ultimate goal is basic income, maybe sort of peeling off some part of the population actually makes it harder to get the political will to move towards basic income.
Yeah. Well, those are two different questions, and they're both really important, I think. Let me start with the question about politicians using these. I think there were a lot of worries in the design stage of most of these programs. I think rightly that these programs of payment could become kind of slush funds to be used by local politicians to buy political support. And that you might get a situation where the only people who get the payment are the people who are on some list that's managed by some powerful politician. A lot of work went in, as I understand it, to designing them in such a way that would be really hard to do, and to kind of walling off the social protection payment system from local government in particular. I think there's a lot that's been done right in that respect. I mean, there may be people here who know more about it than I do, but my sense is that if you're a South African and you're owed an old age pension, you get it. You don't find that it's gone, or that somebody else has made off with it, or your name's not on the list anymore. These systems at a technical level are quite effective. And there are, I think, ambitions to make them more effective and more tamper-proof through the technologies that are available, including biometric identification and things like this. So the idea is you ought to be able to just get your payment directly transferred into your bank account without going through intermediaries. You shouldn't have to knock on the door of some chief and get a stamp in your document or something in order to access something that's yours by right. With that said, it's not at all clear to me that those kinds of protections and sophisticated schemes are being built into place in some of the other African countries where these schemes have been introduced in a much less systematic and haphazard way, and sometimes only on a project basis. And there's the risk of them going wrong in the same way that so many development projects in Africa have gone wrong. Paul may know more about this.
I can say a couple things. So I think the kind of these issues of execution are definitely first order. I mentioned briefly India's employment scheme. It's something that we've studied. I've done a fair bit of academic work on, and also now some work with the government trying to look at reforms and improvements to it. And we don't know systematically, but plenty of examples of studies where 50 to 75% of the money is getting diverted by intermediaries and middlemen along the way. So you can certainly have bad outcomes. And actually, biometric technology, which Jim mentioned, we found to be incredibly effective at reducing that when we've worked with the government to experimentally evaluate the rollout and introduction of biometric ID. And that's not obvious because there are real risks of exclusion when you roll out something like biometric. People have trouble getting registered for the card, or their thumbprint doesn't scan because they're a farmer and their hands are worn from decades of hard labor and so forth. So we were really surprised by the uniformly positive impacts of investing in some of that infrastructure. So I'm quite bullish on that stuff. I think you also posed a deeper question about this sort of notion. I think you were getting at a notion which Jim, you mentioned in your book, about cash transfers sort of placating people so that they then do not push for deeper or more systemic changes to the political or economic order, which I thought was really interesting. That's counter, not at all the way I think about politics and economics. I think when I think about politics, I think a well-functioning democracy is going to respond, more or less approximately to the preferences of the median voter. And in societies that are both democratic and very unequal, the mean voter is going to be a lot richer than the median voter, and that's going to generate a lot of redistribution, i.e. cash transfers or things like that. And that looks to me like a pretty good first-order approximation of what has been happening in a lot of developing countries kind of over the last few decades. So to me, that sort of looks like, these are all imperfect democracies, but kind of looks like democracy functioning the way it should. But I'm curious if you feel like there are more sinister things out there that we got to be worried about.
Well, it's an argument that I often confront, is the idea that, well, yeah, you're giving people a little bit of money that's going to help them, but you're basically buying them off with crumbs from the table.
Right.
And the people who would otherwise have been in a position to press for really radical change are going to be rendered quiescent by being bought off. And I have two reactions to that. One is that where you can observe very, very poor people who are in fact being given nothing, they're not militant. They're not at the barricades demanding a revolution, right? They're actually quite easy to control. I mean, I spent a lot of years working in Zambia. And the people who have least are not the most radical. On the contrary, they're the people who are least likely to make trouble. The other question is, what happens when people who have not previously gotten anything from the state suddenly become people who have what are to them very important and sizable claims that they get from the state?
Yeah.
And I suspect the answer is that they become accustomed to making those claims, right? They start to look at the state not as something that you try to avoid because you might get in trouble, but as something that you might turn to and make requests of because it's worked in the past. Mm-hmm. For people who think that you can make poor people become quiescent and inactive by giving them money, I suggest you try giving some poor people some money. They will come back and re-engage with you in one way or another. They will return and try to establish a relationship that can replicate the terms of the original gift, as I'm sure you've discovered. Yeah. With that said, I also think it's not right to answer questions like that theoretically. I think these are empirical questions, and this is part of that larger kind of field of experimentation that I'm interested in. And I mean both formal experiments of the kind that Paul's talking about, but are also thinking about political strategy as a series of experiments, things that we think might be good ideas, but we're humble enough to know that we don't know the answer, and try them out in certain ways and see what happens. And I think that this question about are small cash payments mobilizing or demobilizing? It's an empirical question, and I think we're in the process of doing a bunch of experiments that are enabling us to give answers to that question.
Yeah, I would add, I think that, we're sitting here in the UK, I think that donor governments probably have a lot to add here. I was in Pakistan a year or two back and went outside of Karachi to meet random people who were participating in Pakistan has a large program called the Benazir Income Support Program, and so we went to find people who were in this program and asked them how it worked. And, it was not working well. Like they said, payments stopped half a year ago, and I was told that if I want to turn them back on, I have to go see someone at the local office of the political party. Mm-hmm. And so that definitely looks like an example where a cash transfer program has been turned into another mechanism of control for the ruling elite, right? So that seems like a real risk.
Yeah, no,
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
To your point about implementation. The flip side of that is to the extent that the BIS program works well at all, it's actually, I think, largely to DFID's credit, right? Because when the program was getting set up, the initial plan was literally to have every MP come back with a list of names from their district and say, these are the poor people in my district. And DFID were the ones who pushed and said we should have some kind of means testing and some way of identifying people, and it happened because of them. So, I think that that's an important role that donors who are co-financing some of these programs can play, right, to push for that.
So what happens when you give a household $1,000, and how do you know that?
Yeah, so there have been a number of studies of these sort of large one-time lump sum cash transfers around the world. Chris, you've done some of them. You've been focused on micro-entrepreneurs, and there have been some, I would say there have been some cases where these had really big positive impacts and some cases where less so. With households, I think similarly, we've had sort of grants to young men and women in Uganda that have had really big long-term 4 or 5 year, and we're going to get 8-year results soon, impacts on their earnings, with numbers like you give somebody $100 and then 4 years later they're earning $40 more per year, so sort of 40% rate of return range. And numbers like that are really exciting, right? We don't typically see numbers that big, and we don't have evidence of 4 or 5 year impacts of many interventions and development. So, we think that's exciting. We also, have examples in which large one-time transfers have, people have spent them, their lives have gotten better, but it hasn't sort of changed their standard of living 4 or 5 years out. And so, we think one of the priorities and what we're working on right now at Give Directly is to try to understand that, like for whom is just not having money the binding constraint, and then for whom are things more complicated, right? Because sometimes it is more complicated.
What are people doing that generates the incomes 4 years out? I mean, what do they do? What does the grant enable them to do?
The key answer is that there's no answer, right? In the sense that it's an incredible diversity of things, right? So I think something like 30% of people in the first evaluation we did bought livestock. So if you're a fan of the give person a cow, like the heifer model, that's not a crazy idea, right? A lot of poor people want to buy cows, but it's not everybody. It's 30%, right? Fair number of people bought land. People buy other productive assets. A lot of people bought metal roofs for their homes, which is interesting because it's one of these things that as an outsider to the community doesn't seem all that exciting, like development. But it turns out it's a really high return thing to do because if you don't have a metal roof, you have to replace your thatch roof every year, and that's quite expensive. So the rate of return on that we think is maybe 20% a year. And then there's even more out there stuff, right? We had one guy who bought bees and became set up an apiary. We had one guy who bought musical instruments and started a band and started touring. So that in a way is to me the point of it, that if you try to say what is the impact, you sort of miss the point, which is that look around you, people are wildly different. We all do different things to support ourselves, to find fulfillment in life. And part of what you do when you give people money is you let them make those choices for themselves.
Can I just say, with respect to these kind of experiments we're talking about, the Give Directly stuff gives you a really good idea of what the economic effects can be of transferring small amounts of cash, or not so small in your case. I'm not sure that you can get the same kind of reading of what political effects are being created because it's not the state that's making the transfer, right? As you say, from their point of view, it's Publishers Clearinghouse. It sort of falls out of the sky.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't raise the same kinds of questions about, do the people who give me this money owe me something? Do I have a relation with a political representation with them? Can I make other kinds of claims against them? Can the same people who give me the money also give me clean water and fix the roads and things like that? So I think there's a whole bunch of political questions that await a similar kind of opportunity for political experimentation.
I mostly agree with that. Although the politicians that work in areas that we operate they're quite interested in the political impacts.
Oh, I'm sure, yeah. They would like people to imagine that they're the ones who delivered it, right?
I guess also, what do people think about that? Do they think you're never coming back, or do they think? I mean, I know when we did our cash transfers and with micro enterprises, I think there was a sense among some of them that if we do well with this, they'll give us more.
Yeah.
And so there is kind of there's perhaps an expectation that it is going to be repeated at some point in the future.
Yeah, it's not something we've measured. It's a reasonable question. The one thing that we did gather, which I think is kind of interesting, is we always ask people for feedback, and it's very hard to get constructive criticism from people to whom you've just given a year's earnings. But we try, and there's a fair number of people that say this is great. If you can send any more money, that would be even better. But there are also quite a lot of people that said, this is great, and I hope you can do it for the next village or for the other people in my village or things like that. So that, maybe that gives some hope that kind of Jim's ambition for us to come to see that as a universal, reasonable claim to make is achievable. Yeah.
I'm thinking also they did a pilot basic income project in Namibia, just one district.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting effects there was that people were aware that it was a pilot project, right? And so there was kind of local organization within the community around the fact that this project was going to happen, and people decided that they had to make sure that the community didn't spoil everything by misusing the funds, right? And so people got together and they said, look, everybody, they're going to be watching us. This is not going to last if we screw it up. So don't drink it. Don't drink it all away, right? And they gathered up all the habitual drunkards and they sort of lectured them.
That's amazing.
So yeah, it's interesting to think, actually. I mean, and you could say, well, that just shows that it's not generalizable because you're getting all these. But I think there's a set of more interesting questions that are not just about how representative a pilot project is, but about what is the effect of making people feel like somebody's noticing whether or not they're drunk or not. Somebody is sort of surveilling and assessing and evaluating your conduct as an implicit condition of the money that you're receiving.
Yeah.
And I don't know quite how to think about that, but I think it's probably important.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really great. It's a fascinating and totally believable story. I think, when I think about the broad set evidence base on cash and substance abuse, there's a really nice review put out recently by folks at the World Bank, which meta-analysis of all the studies we have on this and actually found, on average, negative impacts. So people are drinking and smoking less when they get cash. So, these
That's
are...
what they found in Namibia as well, by the
yeah.
way. Yeah.
And so, I don't know if it's because of perceptions like this or not. I think it's possible that we have dramatically oversimplified the way we think about substance abuse. Personal reflection, when I think about people, I've lost a couple of people who were close to me to drug overdoses, and when I think about their substance abuse or the people I've known, I think it's been much more self-medication to deal with something truly painful than it has been a sort of, went to a party, it was fun, slipped into it, got hooked. Right? Yeah. And so this is very speculative, but I think that it's possible that the model is more complicated, and the relationship between your economic well-being, things like cash transfers and substance abuse, is more complicated than a lot of people give it credit for.
Well, we know that substance abuse is found at all levels of society, in every society I know of.
So let me say. So I had kind of come in here thinking, well, there's going to be a trade-off between, governments only have so much money, donors only have so much money, so there's a trade-off between programs that try to create jobs, and we think about vocational training, entrepreneurship training, lots of different. There's a lot of money spent on jobs, not just NREGs and those kind of direct jobs, but also training programs. Yeah. And cash transfers. And your response on what people did kind of makes me think: is it a trade-off, or do we think that cash transfers may work through some sort of training, and of course that depends on a market being there for those kinds of services. But how do we think about that, the trade-off between, or the relationship between, trying to undertake policies that are going to get people jobs that also come with income and that go back to the model, or giving up on creating jobs and giving people cash transfers instead?
Yeah, let me give you the no trade-off answer and then the big trade-off. There is a big trade-off answer. So I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that we could easily convert into cash transfers at zero or negative opportunity cost. There are distortionary subsidies, right? So a lot of governments pay people to consume fossil fuels, which makes no sense. A lot of governments subsidize things in a very regressive way, so they pay people to consume stuff that rich people consume more of. That also doesn't make much sense. And there are things we spend a lot of money on that have been tested a lot and found to not be very effective. And I think actually job training programs are kind of a leading example of that we spend billions of dollars a year trying to train people to make them more employable. And very little evidence that those things make people more employable, right? So those are things that I think we could, at zero or even negative opportunity cost, turn into a straight cash transfer, and it would be a big win. I think the skeptical viewpoint, especially when you start talking about a cash transfer program as big as a universal basic income, and Jim, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this because I know you're excited, is that costs a lot of money, right? If you look at a typical developing country, let's say you want to give everybody in a country $1 a day, so $365 a year. Like simple math, you think about what's GDP in this country. If GDP is $3,500 a year, that's 10% of GDP, right? That's probably all of government revenue, right? A lot of these countries collect about 10% of GDP as tax revenue, right? That's just nowhere close to being plausible, right? At least in the near future. So I don't know if you disagree, but I think that there's a lot of enthusiasm about UBI and not a whole lot of fiscal realism yet, at least for many of these countries.
Well, a lot depends on the amount. And the amounts that have been floated in Southern Africa are substantially less than $1 a day, so something on the order of half that.
Yeah.
And of course, some of these countries have more resources to play with than others.
Yep.
South Africa and Brazil are not the Central African Republic.
Yeah.
So I think you have to think both about the economics of it and about the administrative capability of government in question. But one of the things that comes out of the research is even what seem like insultingly small amounts of money often make a big difference in the lives of very poor people. So it's easy to sit here and say, $1 a day, that's nothing, right? Even 20 cents a day might make a difference if you're talking about people in Malawi, say.
Yeah. Could I ask you, or if you want to keep going, but maybe come back to this, but I'm curious, if I'm a political activist sitting in a country that can't afford a UBI, which would you give up first, the U or the B?
Well, I'm not sure what the B means, but you mean the amount.
To achieve some basic standard of living, right? And your point is that a lot of these are much smaller than that, and maybe that's okay. So would you give up the B before the U?
Yeah, I don't think you really have a choice because of the inability to properly distinguish income. I mean, you can do it by region, which is what some places are doing. I think they're just picking sort of poverty-stricken regions of the country to roll out their pilots in.
Or conditions of different types. I mean,
Right.
South Africa doesn't have universal basic income, but it has conditional cash transfers for people in certain categories.
Yes,
so you can do
no,
it
that's
by
right.
by
Yeah,
category.
you can do elderly people, for instance. And I think that's fine. And I think you're not going to begin probably in most African countries. You're not going to begin with a universal benefit. I think it's going to have to sort of creep in from the margins. But I like your idea, Paul, of the thinking of cash as a kind of default. Of to say, if you're planning on running a project in this area anyway, and it's going to cost so many dollars per person, you should evaluate that project against not the idea of doing nothing, but the idea of using that same amount of money and directly transferring it to people. And I think an awful lot of projects would fail that test, right? Which is probably why a lot of major development agencies are a little wary about the whole idea.
Slow to catch on.
Yeah. As far as the trade-off goes, there clearly is a trade-off between cash transfers on the one hand and public works programs on the other. And public works programs are often much more politically saleable. What they offer is a job, and what they offer is a payment for somebody who works for it and not somebody who's getting a handout. And there's all this sort of rhetoric that makes public works programs more popular. But the trade-offs are really bad in the sense that in every case I know, you spend a huge amount of money administering the program, and the actual money you spend on the program, only a small fraction of it actually gets into the hands of the people you're aimed at targeting. So I think there the case is pretty good that the cash transfers are more efficient in terms of the desire to distribute funds. But there are other ways in which you could spend money that's targeted at creating jobs, as you say. It doesn't have to be these big fat public employment programs. There are real questions about how effective those are, though. I think there's a series of arguments that I don't think we know enough to say a lot for sure about what the effects are of people getting cash. But the argument that's made is that the kinds of small amounts of cash we're talking about don't make anybody any less desirous of having a job, right? You don't say, oh, I'm set now, I've got a cash transfer, I don't need a job. That more often what they do is activate people and enable them to do things like go and look for work because they now have the taxi fare to get across town and go into town and see if anybody's hiring. Yep. And they may also enable people to take chances pursuing livelihoods in the informal sector that they might not otherwise be able to do.
Yeah. It's just like getting tenure. You actually work harder.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Right, Chris?
So,
okay.
You know, the example I remember was that there's an old woman who's living on the edge of destitution. She's making it, but she knows that she's very close to falling into destitution, and she has a little sort of sum of emergency money that she's put aside just so she'll be able to cope if something happens that sort of pushes her over that edge. And you come to her and you say, take that money and buy a sewing machine and set yourself up as a tailor. You can have a small business. And she says, not on your life, because then what will I do if I fail? Because I have this little bit of capital that's my check against destitution. And the argument is, yes, but if this woman had a small but regular monthly payment coming in and knew that it was secure, then she would be freed to take that chance, which she now can't afford to take. Now, this is not my argument. This is an argument that...
Well, how important is it, do you think that's true? Because I think, we set up this big RCT at Give Directly. It's like the most ambitious experimental evaluation of basic income that's been done yet. It's going to be the longest running. It's going to be randomized at the community level, which hasn't been done before. But we felt like it was important to know if what you just said is true, right? Yes. But I think other people, so like Y Combinator, which is a sort of a tech incubator in Oakland and in San Francisco, are running a pilot. And, Sam Altman has said, maybe people are going to smoke weed and play video games, and that's all right, right? Uh-huh. Like, how important is it to you that Sam is wrong? Or do you think that actually that's fine too?
Well, I think if you're dealing with scarce public funds that could do a lot of good for a lot of very, very poor people, and you misuse them and use them in a way that doesn't have the effects that you want, I think that you have to have a sense of responsibility about that. I mean, I understand the sort of libertarian idea that people should be entitled to make their own mistakes. And,
You're a Washington up there.
Yeah, right? Exactly. But no, I think these questions deserve to be taken seriously, and and they can be studied, right? It's not as if we just have to sit here and wonder. But I wonder also, I mean, you gave examples of giving people a pretty large chunk of money and then expecting it to last them a while.
Yeah.
And I wonder what your thoughts are on the benefits of that versus the steady, the check comes every month and it comes every month kind of thing, which is more characteristic of the state-run systems.
Yeah, I totally think that is a first-order question. So we've Give Directly is unusual in the sense that we give people these large grants, which they can use to, make a major investment, purchase an asset or something like that. Right, and most of the public sector programs are these much, this drip of small payments, which was, explicitly designed to kind of prevent malnutrition, starving bad, things like that.
Right, you can't blow
And I got to say, we've run pilots where we've given people the choice. We've said you could have it all at once or in a stream of 12 monthly payments. Mm-hmm. And absolutely nobody chooses 12 monthly payments.
But that may be a trust issue.
Well,
is there interest on that, or it's the same? It's the total divided by 12.
If you choose the one payment, you don't get it right now. You get it in one of the next 12 months, right? So the kind of expected time at which a dollar arrives is the same across these choices, right? Yeah. There's, in fact, in the basic income village, apparently one of the things people have done is they have gotten together and set up basically a Rosca, right, which is one of these devices that helps, everybody puts in their monthly payment, and each month one person gets the aggregated sum, right? So there is just like a lot of demand.
People do all over the world, right?
Yeah. There is a lot of demand, across a lot of settings, a lot of studies among poor people for lumpiness, right? They would like to take streams of small payments and turn them into one big payment because there's something that would otherwise be hard for them to save up for. And so, one way you could do this, which I think is totally feasible, I was actually down at DFID today encouraging them to encourage people to try this, is, you can set up a basic income, but then give people the option of getting, a year's worth of payments at once, if they want, if that works better for them.
Interesting.
So this all sort of suggests that we need to get some more ethnographers out there working with some of these people who are getting money to really see what's going on and what's behind some of these
Well,
decisions.
if you could combine the experiments with the ethnographic, it would be very powerful, I think.
I think everybody's an amateur ethnographer, right?
We
should get some real ones. Yeah.
Right. Right. So one issue that's come up a couple of times is state capacity and so forth. So, an increasing share of the poor in the world are living in fragile, conflict, affected areas where the state capacity is weaker for delivering these kinds of income transfers. That's related to a question of, income levels are vastly different. I mean, you've worked in South Africa, actually, relatively high income per capita relative to other countries in Africa. And how do we think about both the technical issues with delivering these transfers in fragile states and the difference across country? Mm-hmm. Not just the within-country income inequality, but the cross-country income inequality.
Yes. Yeah, I think people, including me, have changed their way of thinking about this. We used to suppose that to have anything that looked like a kind of social welfare state required a certain kind of state, right? A state that has both a lot of administrative capacity and a lot of informational capacity, right? So my state that pays me Social Security knows every job I ever had and has a record of what wage I was paid and knows the date on which I was born and knows where I live and how many children I have and what the name of the woman I'm married to is. And all of that is sort of known and cataloged in databases and drawn on to decide what should my payment be, do I qualify, am I old enough to get it yet, right? All of that stuff is sort of information qualified. And so on those grounds, if you're talking about African states with weak capacity and programs of social assistance, you'd say, well, you have to wait until you've acquired the kind of state that can administer this kind of project. Otherwise, it'll just be a mess. But this is where radical unconditionality starts to look very interesting, right? Because if you really are going to pay every single person a basic income payment every single month, you don't have to know when they were born, and you don't have to know where they're living, and you don't have to know who they work for. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that that is no longer necessary in informational terms. And it may, in fact, be that all you need to know is whether this person has been paid yet this month or not. And that you can do with biometrics and things like that don't even require a national ID card. So that kind of opens the door, right? That suggests that it is technically possible to introduce systems of cash payments in a much broader range of cases than we had thought. And we've now seen cash payments used, for instance, in schemes to demobilize soldiers in post-conflict situations, right? Where if you give up your gun, in exchange you get a guarantee that you're going to get a monthly check for a certain number of months. And we know that it's you because we took your biometric information when you handed in the gun, right? And so it's requiring us to kind of open up our minds to thinking about different kinds of possibilities of what the social might be in places that have so-called weak states. It has also required me to kind of open up my mind about biometrics, because I think most of us, sort of progressive critical scholars, tend to be very suspicious at the idea of biometrics, right? That it's some tool that's going to be used by powerful people to gain even more control than they already have over the rest of us. And, there are reasons to attend to those dangers, for sure. But I'm also, I'm struck when Paul talked about the people worrying about biometrics as exclusionary, which again, right to be worried about that. But paper documentation is the alternative, right? And we know that paper documentation is incredibly exclusionary of poor people, right? They're the ones who have the hardest time getting their papers together. They're the ones who have the hardest time with literacy. They're the ones who have the hardest time dealing with offices and filling out forms and all the at every level of a system of paper documentation, you've got processes that are quite starkly exclusionary. Whereas just standing in line and having somebody take a picture of your iris is potentially much more open and potentially much more democratic. So I think we have to not immediately know that we're against something just because it gives us a bad feeling when we look at it. I think we have to say, well, what it does is open up a field of possibilities. Now let's have an analysis of what those possibilities are and how this might play out in either dangerous ways or hopeful ways.
Yeah, hard to disagree with that. It's very reasonable. I think there are real concerns in a place like India that the government is incredibly ambitious to roll out this stuff in places that don't have connectivity, don't have reliable electricity, and so we worry about those things. I think, as you say, it's an empirical question. What I'd add to your earlier comments about sort of the scope or the set of places in which this is viable is I think there's a real political dimension of this to be aware of, especially within the aid world. Because I think that as more and more pressure is building up to use cash transfers, as the evidence piles up that they're a more effective, a more cost-effective way of helping poor people, one of the ways through which the aid world is trying to respond and retain control over decision-making and retain relevance is by saying it's important to have people who figure out where you can do cash and where you can't. So there's sort of a cottage industry now of people, consultants who will get hired to do like market readiness assessments and figure out whether a certain place is ready for cash or not, right? So the bureaucrats can still have some decision that they're enabled to make. And I'm very skeptical of this. Like we did an exercise in Uganda this year where we literally picked the most remote part of Uganda. We said, where in Uganda is mobile money coverage the absolute worst? And then we gave a bunch of people their mobile money. And 100% of them have figured out some way of getting it out, right? And, they had to travel a long distance. Some of them gave it to their friend who traveled and cashed out for them. It's messy, but they find a way. And I think that if we let ourselves become skeptical and too pessimistic about that stuff, we just create jobs for consultants.
I mean, if you got to think if you can't give people cash, what can you? I mean, what services can you deliver? I mean, it's in some senses, especially it's one of the easiest ones.
Yeah.
In a way,
and you don't ever hear anybody saying this place isn't ready for wage labor. I mean, you've got the Eastern Congo. If there was ever a place that's not ready for wage labor, that's it, right? That doesn't stop people from going in and hiring people to do this incredibly dangerous, mining and with political violence and no functioning monetary apparatus.
Or research surveys. In case of a couple of people that I know. Great. So we've actually run over time. So I've not run out of questions, and I'm sure others haven't either. But we've run out of time. So let me bring this to a close formally. I think Jim and Paul will hang around for a little while. So if you have questions, come down and chat. And let me thank Blavatnik, the Center for the Study of African Economies, and especially Jim and Paul for a really interesting conversation. Thanks.